All right, let's walk through this period of early American history step by step so that not only do you know the facts, but you actually understand how everything connects. To begin, it's important to understand the situation of the United States in the early 1800s. The country is still young, still figuring itself out, and still dealing with pressure from Europe, especially Britain and France. One of the major issues at the time is trade and neutrality. Both Britain and France are interfering with American shipping, even going as far as impressment, which is when they take American sailors and force them into service. This creates a lot of tension. In response, President Thomas Jefferson passes the Embargo Act of 1807. This law essentially shuts down all American foreign trade. The goal is to avoid war and pressure Britain and France economically, but instead it backfires badly. It causes a major economic collapse in the United States because American businesses rely heavily on trade. As a result, many Americans begin to support going to war, especially a group known as the War Hawks. These are younger Democratic Republicans, including Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, who believe that war with Britain could actually help the economy and possibly allow the United States to gain territory. This growing tension leads directly into the War of 1812. This war lasts from 1812 to 1815 and is essentially a second war between the United States and Britain. The United States is not fully prepared. Years of budget cuts had weakened the military, leaving the army small and the navy limited. During the war, the British even managed to invade Washington, D.C., and burn down the White House and other government buildings. One important moment during the war is the attack on Fort McHenry. After witnessing the battle, Francis Scott Key writes what will become the national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. Eventually, the war ends with the Treaty of Ghent, which restores things to how they were before the war. In other words, no land is gained, and neither side truly wins. However, Americans view the war as a success because they stood up to Britain again and survived. This sense of survival and pride leads into a new period known as the Era of Good Feelings. During this time, there is a strong sense of national unity. The Federalist Party, which had been one of the two major political parties, collapses and disappears. This leaves the Democratic Republicans as the dominant political force. President James Monroe plays a big role in promoting unity by forming a cabinet that represents different regions of the country and by avoiding strong partisan divisions. However, even though this period is called the Era of Good Feelings, the unity is somewhat misleading. Beneath the surface, serious tensions are beginning to develop. Different regions of the country have different economic interests. The North is becoming more industrial, the South remains dependent on slavery and agriculture, and the West is focused on expansion. These differences will become more important over time. During Monroe's presidency, one of the most important foreign policy decisions is the Monroe Doctrine. This doctrine states that European countries should no longer attempt to colonize or interfere in the Western Hemisphere. In return, the United States promises to stay out of European affairs. At the time, the United States does not have the military power to fully enforce this idea, and it is actually supported by the British Navy. However, over time, the Monroe Doctrine becomes a key part of American foreign policy and is used to justify U.S. influence in the Americas for many years. At the same time, the country is dealing with important domestic issues. One example is the Missouri Compromise, created by Henry Clay. This agreement allows Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state and Maine as a free state, while also establishing a boundary line for slavery at 36 degrees 30 minutes latitude. This is an early attempt to maintain balance between free and slave states. Economically, the country is also changing. The introduction of interchangeable parts, developed by Eli Whitney, revolutionizes manufacturing. Instead of needing highly skilled workers to create entire products, factories can now produce standardized parts that can be easily assembled or replaced. This leads to the growth of factories and what are known as mill towns, where entire families work in industrial settings. Meanwhile, in the South, the economy is becoming even more dependent on slavery. The invention of the cotton gin makes cotton production far more efficient, which increases the demand for enslaved labor. Slave codes are put in place to strictly control the lives of enslaved people, reinforcing a system where they are treated as property. As the nation grows, so does its focus on expansion. Many Americans believe in manifest destiny, the idea that it is the nation's God-given right to expand across the continent. This belief encourages westward migration along routes like the Oregon Trail and leads to conflicts with Native Americans and other nations. Now, as we move forward, political unity begins to break down. A key turning point is the election of 1824. In this election, 4 candidates run for president, including Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and William Crawford. Andrew Jackson wins the popular vote but does not win enough electoral votes to secure the presidency. According to the Constitution, the decision then goes to the House of Representatives. Henry Clay, who is the Speaker of the House, throws his support behind John Quincy Adams. Adams is then elected president, and shortly afterward, he appoints Clay as his Secretary of State. Jackson and his supporters are furious and call this the corrupt bargain. They believe that the election was unfairly decided through political deals rather than the will of the people. This event has major consequences. It leads to the breakup of the Democratic-Republican Party and the creation of new political parties. Andrew Jackson and his supporters form what becomes the Democratic Party, marking the beginning of a new era in American politics. When Jackson is eventually elected president in 1828, he brings a very different style of leadership. He is often seen as a strong, even authoritarian figure, sometimes referred to as King Andrew by his critics. He relies on a group of informal advisors known as the Kitchen Cabinet and uses patronage or giving government jobs to supporters to maintain power. One of the major issues during Jackson's presidency is the bank war. Jackson strongly opposes the Second National Bank, believing it favors the wealthy and gives too much power to a centralized institution. He vetoes its recharter and removes federal funds from the bank, placing them into smaller state banks. This contributes to economic instability and eventually leads to the Panic of 1837, a major economic downturn that occurs after Jackson leaves office. Another major issue during this time is nullification. Nullification is the idea that a state has the right to ignore or reject a federal law if it believes the law is unconstitutional. This idea is strongly supported by John C. Calhoun, particularly in response to tariffs that the South believes are unfair. South Carolina attempts to nullify federal tariffs, leading to a crisis. Although Jackson supports states' rights, he firmly opposes nullification and makes it clear that the federal government will enforce its laws. This moment highlights the growing tension between state and federal authority. At the same time, Jackson's policies toward Native Americans have devastating consequences. The Indian Removal Act allows the federal government to force Native American tribes off their land and move them west. This leads to the Trail of Tears, during which thousands of Native Americans die during forced relocation. As we continue into the 1830s and 1840s, new political divisions emerge. The Whig Party forms as a major opposition to Jackson and his Democratic Party. The Whigs generally oppose strong executive power and support a more active role for Congress. Economically, the country faces serious challenges. The Panic of 1837 is caused by factors such as land speculation, falling cotton prices, and banks stopping lending. This economic crisis defines the presidency of Martin Van Buren, who struggles to recover from the damage. Meanwhile, expansion continues to shape the nation. Texas becomes a major issue. Originally part of Mexico, Texas is settled by Americans who do not fully adopt Mexican culture or laws. Tensions rise, leading to the Texas Revolution. One of the most famous events is the Battle of the Alamo, where Texan forces are defeated by Mexican troops under General Santa Anna. Although it is a loss, it becomes a powerful symbol and rallying cry. Eventually, Texas wins its independence and later becomes part of the United States, though this raises concerns because it would enter as a slave state, further increasing tensions between North and South. Throughout this entire period, it is also important to understand the idea of the antebellum era. This refers to the time before the Civil War, particularly in the South. It is often associated with images of wealthy plantation life, but this image hides the reality of a system built on slavery and strict social hierarchy. At the same time, technological advancements are transforming the country. The invention of the telegraph by Samuel Morse allows for nearly instant communication across long distances, helping to connect the growing nation. Transportation improvements, such as roads and canals, also make it easier to move goods and people. Finally, it is important to remember that while this period may seem like one of growth and progress, it is also laying the groundwork for future conflict. Issues like slavery, states' rights, economic differences, and expansion are all becoming more intense. So when you think about this period as a whole, you should see it not just as a time of development, but as a time when the United States is quietly building toward much larger conflicts that will eventually lead to the Civil War.